In this video, we'll be philosophizing on philosophical curiosity as it pertains to distinctions within the overarching personality characteristics related to the overarching subcomponents consisting of certain personality characteristics within intellect that are meaningful to cultivate more current to future oriented curious explorations of what's meaningful in terms of engaging more creative and or inventive and or innovative thinking within the personality characteristics philosophical thinking and or need for cognition and or perspective taking, each meaningful to engage the cultivation of curiosity from exploring the internal and or external intellectual environment associated with distinct component parts and or processes that engage more deliberate, meaningful utterances of thought that sharpen and or refine one's thinking, more related to the desire to engage meaningful learning and or creative problem solving. Philosophical thinking is most related to cognitive flexibility and or thinking in more imaginative yet practical, intellectual, future-oriented directions to solve complex problems that may engage more metaphoric and or imaginative yet not quite always possible scenarios that one may cook up in one's thinking with more truthful practicalities within the probabilistic intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties one is inferring within distinct certain component parts and or processes of the situations one may imagine, be it one's thinking of being cloned and or what it would mean to be cloned in terms of defining one's meaning in life. Would one cease to have the uniqueness and or originality to one's intrinsic being had one been cloned, and or the clone could replace nearly all meaningful work one would supposedly be expected to be replaced by, yet there's meaningful intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties that are within this supposed identical clone lacking, meaning one's subjectivity and or upbringing, the origin of the clone, whom is cloned in a lab, more likely to be grown, not necessarily whom has biological parents whom not necessarily uniquely just influence an individual's genome, yet the epigenome with the most meaningful childhood experiences the clone is deprived of, meaning there are going to be certain distinctions in terms of most meaningfully meaning in life that are unique to the original, not the clone. That's more useful for inferring certain intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties within philosophical thinking compared to the opposite polarity most associated with linear thinking, engaging more narrow and or often inappropriate thought processes that are more vague, lacking logic connections within the meaningful utterances of thought, failing to engage the meaningful logic connectors within what is meaningful to appropriately communicate with clarity certain details that truthfully optimize one's creative problem solving instead of repeating per se certain solutions one may learn external to the self, and or may think one holds a meaningful explanation, yet has most difficulty articulating with a adequate to moderate okayness in terms of being able to appropriately satisfy the necessary conditions in order to solve certain problems with certain feelings of satisfaction, yet are not quite optimal to engage meaningful trial and or error learning, as well to elaborate more meaningfully in terms of being able to communicate to another exactly what one is solving in terms of a complex problem and or needs to conduct in order to solve certain issues with meaningful detail in terms of one's communication or descriptions that fill in gaps in meaningful information and or optimize the learning for the other individual with the least amount of assumptions and or need to for oneself engage more trial and or error learning. Compared to need for cognition, that's most related to necessitating the need to seek out information and or explore more curiously various learning opportunities and or engage, in some cases, creative problem solving, yet it's most related to self-conducted learning and the cultivation of curiosity. So when we're thinking about philosophical curiosity, most of the curiosity component of philosophical curiosity is related to need for cognition. The opposite polarity of need for cognition is assumptiveness, dogmatism, as individuals who are more curious are more open to explore distinct ideas and or engage more cognitive flexibility, questioning assumptions and or filling in gaps in meaningful information instead of assuming one holds self-knowledge and or self-awareness and or has no meaningful need to truly elaborate and or constitute meaningful self-knowledge and or self-awareness, and may, from the immediate irrationalities that float into one's consciousness, conduct inappropriately certain misconducts from what is more assumptive in one's meaningful utterances of thought, lacking appropriately critical thinking and or the desire to cultivate curiosity in order to truly elaborate one's self-knowledge and or self-awareness to be able to know what one is communicating. Meaning a need for cognition is most associated with satisfying the essential and or necessitated underlying psychological need for knowledge and or individual autonomy and or meaning in life, building more independence within one's learning pursuits and or being able to engage meaningful self-conducted learning from the desire to learn, cultivating curiosity from engaging that proactive learning process, compared to perspective taking, most associated with more deeper perspectival processing and or engaging cognitive flexibility, with the opposite polarity of perspective taking being rigidness. Meaning that perspective taking, though holding many meaningful similarities to need for cognition, is mostly related to the angle one perceives, in some cases, the exact same intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties with a distinct perspective and or desire to engage creative problem solving with a distinct solution within the options one's evaluating, inferring the same and or meaningful similarities within certain intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, engaging proactively perspective taking that deepens the perspectival process and may elaborate self-knowledge and or self-awareness, yet is not quite the same as the seeking out information and or engaging the self-conducted learning process more proactively as need for cognition, that's more proactive in terms of filling in gaps in meaningful information, whereas perspective taking is more likely to elaborate prior existing self-knowledge and or self-awareness and or may fill in gaps in meaningful information, yet it's more domain specific to the intercategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies within the unique intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties one is engaging perspective taking, not necessarily elaborating more expansive intercategorical and or intracategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies related to entire intercategorical and or intracategorical problems. For example, individuals whom are higher in need for cognition will often seek out opportunities to learn more in the workplace and or will explore distinct tools and or technologies more freely and or with certain proactive attempts to engage one's curiosity practically to solve certain problems, not necessarily reflect on the most meaningful solutions and or another angle to perceive the world from. Perspective taking is more likely to engage our compassionate thinking to, in some cases, put ourselves in another's shoes and or to engage meta-reflection of the self from attempting to be more critical of certain volitions and or conducts, from taking a step back to reanalyze one's being from a different mountaintop, as be it that you were to hike a mountaintop on the north and a mountaintop on the west, each with distinct summits from distinct altitudes in distinct localities, yet stare upon the same valley may shape your perspective, what you see and or what you're more sensitive to. Be it the intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties are truly meaningfully similar, there isn't as much need for cognition within the perspective taking, yet there is enough association within need for cognition and or perspective taking to constitute intellect, meaning that there always should be some positive correlation existing within philosophical thinking and or need for cognition and or perspective taking. Had one engaged perspective taking with a lack of need for cognition, there would be serious deficits and or impairments and or disabilities within one's perspective taking, likely more reflecting individuals who may be more on the autism spectrum, who may have more difficulty engaging more cognitive flexibility within distinct domains that are outside one's meaningful concern and or essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs that are more relevant and or appropriate and or meaningful, that certain individuals who may be more highly sensitive to certain stimulation may be more reluctant and or avoidant of approaching and or may need assistance in order to satisfy certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs they are inappropriately satisfying, whereby an individual whom is more exploratory is more likely to engage a healthy psychological functioning sense of need for cognition combined with perspective taking, being able to appropriately engage self-preferential evaluations that are combinative of their essential and or necessitated underlying psychological need evaluations, who may engage philosophical thinking in terms of more complex thinking and elaborating one's philosophical curiosity. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keep moving this opposite